They did not build cities. They did not raise monuments. They left no written chronicles of their victories. And yet, for centuries, some of the most powerful empires on Earth feared them. In the deserts and mountains of the American Southwest, a people lived by a single, unyielding law: survival. The sun burned white over the sandstone cliffs. The wind howled through canyons, carrying dust that could blind a man in moments. Water was scarce. Game was scarce. The land could kill a careless traveler in a single day. And yet, the Apache thrived. They moved like shadows. They struck like lightning. Every ridge, every hidden spring, every narrow pass, they knew it all. No empire could map it fully. No army could master it. The desert was their ally. The mountains were their fortress. When the first outsiders arrived, the Spanish with armor, steel swords, and horses, they believed the land could be claimed by force. They brought priests to teach, soldiers to conquer, and settlers to colonize. But the Apache did not submit. They resisted. And they resisted with a ferocity that would echo across centuries. They were not conquerors. They were not rulers. They were survivors, warriors, strategists. They hunted, they raided, they vanished. They learned the ways of the land so deeply that it became part of them. Every movement, every choice, every decision tuned to survival and freedom. This is not a romantic legend. This is not a story polished for comfort. This is the untold history of the Apache, the people who defied every empire, who fought armies 10 times their size, who turned the desert itself into a battlefield where only they could truly fight and survive. Before Geronimo would become a name whispered in fear, before Cochise and Victorio led their bands across mountains and deserts, before the Bascom affair would ignite decades of relentless conflict, there was the land itself, harsh, unyielding, alive. The desert was a teacher. Its lessons were carved in stone, written in the movement of animals, carried on the wind. Children learned to read these signs before they learned to read words. Every footstep could betray a predator. Every misstep could be fatal. And those who survived learned that freedom and life were inseparable from knowledge, patience, and courage. By the time the Spanish arrived with horses and rifles, the Apache had already mastered the art of living where few could survive. Horses became allies, bows became extensions of the body, arrows flew like shadows. Patience became a weapon as lethal as any sword. Raids were not acts of cruelty. They were precise, calculated, and essential for survival. Horses, food, supplies, these were the currency of life. They struck swiftly, disappeared, and returned only when conditions favored them. Every raid was a lesson in strategy, every retreat a testament to endurance. As empires rose and fell around them, the Apache remained constant. They outlasted the Spanish missions. They resisted Mexican soldiers. They evaded American cavalry in the deserts and mountains only they could navigate. Every empire underestimated them. Every empire learned, too late, that the desert was an ally the Apache had never asked for and one no invader could fully conquer. Their leaders were not born to command armies. Cochise became a diplomat and a warrior, respected for both cunning and honor. Victorio led campaigns across New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and into Mexico itself, slipping through enemy lines like smoke. Geronimo, forged by grief and loss, carried the fight forward, becoming the embodiment of resistance against impossible odds. Even with small numbers, even with the weight of empires against them, they fought with cunning, courage, and the certainty that surrender meant not just defeat, but the end of a way of life. And yet, their story is more than survival.
It is a story of understanding a land so harsh it could kill in a single day. It is a story of resilience, intelligence, and unbroken spirit. It is a story of people who fought not for empire, not for glory, but for the right to exist on the earth that had shaped them for generations. This is the Apache. This is their fight. This is their world. And to understand the ferocity, the cunning, and the unbroken spirit of these warriors, we must look back. We must go further, long before the first invader set foot on their land.
The land the Apache called home was unforgiving. Arid deserts stretched beyond the horizon, baking by day under a white-hot sun. Jagged mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks catching snow in winter and their shaded ravines offering scarce refuge in summer. Water was precious, more precious than gold, and where it flowed, life followed. But water was rare. Here, temperatures soared above what most men could tolerate. By night, the same land plunged into bitter cold that hammered bone and spirit. Sandstorms could arrive without warning, scouring skin and voice alike. Rocks split under relentless sun, springs dried, canyons swallowed heat and spin it back at those who dared enter. This was not a land that rewarded weakness. It was a land that demanded mastery. And the Apache learned to master it. Not through docile submission, not through mimicry of outsiders, but through intimate, unyielding knowledge of every ridge, every wash, every whisper of wind. For generations, Apache bands adapted to an environment that punished mistakes with swift, unrelenting force. They learned how to move silently across open ground, how to vanish into mountains that offered refuge only to the wise, how to find hidden water where outsiders struggled to breathe. They learned which plants could be eaten, which could be used for medicine, which could offer moisture when springs ran dry. They learned the trails of deer and elk, the secret grazing routes of buffalo, and the nesting places of quail and rabbit. And they used this knowledge not as idle lore, but as the basis for survival itself. The Apache were not a single tribe. They were many bands: Chiricahua, Mescalero, Yicarilla, Lipan, Western Apache, bound not by centralized authority, but by a shared language, shared customs, and a shared understanding of survival in the harshest landscape North America had to offer. The Chiricahua roamed from the rugged Dragoon Mountains of southeastern Arizona deep into northern Mexico, learning every stone and cliff face as though it were written in the lines of their own souls. The Mescalero stalked through the Sacramento Mountains of southern New Mexico, drawing sustenance from the mescal plant that would give them their name. The Yicarilla ranged across the highlands and mountain valleys along the upper Rio Grande, adapting to colder climes and tracking elk as well as deer. They hunted, they gathered, they traded with neighboring Pueblo peoples when opportunity allowed, but above all, they moved. They shifted with the seasons, following the cycles of game and plant growth, dancing between the desert plains and the cool heights of the mountains. In the heat of summer, bands climbed high to escape the burning valley floors. In winter, they descended toward lower ground where winds were softer and warmth more forgiving. This rhythm of movement was not aimless wandering, it was strategy, it was survival, it was life itself. Their shelters reflected this mobility. They built wickiups, dome-shaped homes made of bent branches, brush, grasses, and hides, easily assembled and taken down as the seasons turned. In some regions they adopted teepees like the Plains tribes, lightweight and suited for rapid relocation. Like the land they lived in, these dwellings were practical, functional, shaped by necessity rather than permanence. Water was sacred. Few things defined survival more clearly than the ability to find and conserve it. Apache hunters and scouts memorized the location of every spring, seep, and creek bed. They learned how to dig shallow basins that would catch rare rainwater, how to scrape out moisture from cactus and yucca when no running water was near, how to track the subtle signs of underground aquifers.
They knew where water lay hidden under stone, and they guarded these sources as fiercely as they guarded their own lives. Yet even this was not enough on its own. The Apache understood that food, like water, could not be taken for granted. They were among the most skillful hunters in North America, tracking deer, antelope, buffalo, and elk, setting traps, driving herds into ambushes arranged with geometric precision, and using bows and arrows of finely crafted wood and sinew. Women gathered edible plants and roots, harvested mescal, fruit, cactus pads, and seeds, each essential supplement to the diet in a world where game was sometimes scarce. They also learned from their neighbors. Trade with Pueblo peoples brought pottery, corn, beans, and woven goods that broadened diets and strengthened networks of exchange. But trade did not bind them. Apache bands remained free, unconfined, unbowed. And when resources became strained or threats approached, they would not hesitate to raid, a practice driven not by cruelty, but by necessity, by the reality that in this land, starvation was a constant threat. Freedom was not an abstract ideal for the Apache, it was a necessity. To be controlled was to starve, to be confined was to die. This belief was etched into every footstep across the desert sands, into every choice of camp and route of travel, into every arrow loosed and every spring defended. Long before the Spanish crossed the Gulf of California or the Rio Grande, before Mexican soldiers and American cavalry entered these lands, the Apache had already learned to thrive where others could not. They had mastered scarcity, lived with uncertainty, and turned the harshest land into a home. The land that forged them also taught them another lesson, that liberty, once tasted, could never be surrendered without a fight. And this belief, primal and unyielding, would soon put them on a collision course with empire.
Before Europeans arrived, the Apache already lived in a world defined by conflict and survival. It was a world of constant vigilance, where every day demanded awareness and cunning. Every footstep could reveal danger. Every decision could mean life or death. They fought rival tribes, Comanche, Navajo, Pueblo, not out of hatred but for necessity. Hunting grounds, water sources, and seasonal grazing lands were finite, precious. Competition was inevitable. Yet even in these conflicts, there were rules, there were boundaries, there was an unspoken understanding that prevented endless slaughter. The Apache raided and retreated. They adapted to changing circumstances. They learned patterns of other tribes, recognizing when to engage and when to withdraw. War was measured. It was survival, not destruction. In this world, Apache bands developed profound skills. They learned to read the land like a book. Every ridge, every canyon, every ravine had meaning. They tracked animals by subtle disturbances in the soil, recognized water by the bend of a tree or the angle of shadows. They moved silently across open ground, vanishing like smoke when danger approached. They created hidden paths, routes known only to them, twisting through the desert, the mountains, and narrow valleys. The Apache were not a single tribe, but many: Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, Western Apache. Each band had its own territories, its own leaders, and its own traditions, yet all shared language, customs, and strategies for survival. They were bound not by central authority, but by the necessity of living in a harsh, punishing land. The Chiricahua, for example, ranged across southeastern Arizona and northern Mexico, mastering the rugged Dragoon Mountains. They knew where each spring would appear after winter snows, where deer and elk would graze, and which passes offered concealment from enemies. The Mescalero roamed the Sacramento Mountains of southern New Mexico, skilled in hunting and gathering in a land of extremes, named for the mescal plants that sustained them.
The Jicarilla lived in the highlands along the Rio Grande, enduring cold winters and tracking elk across forested valleys. Hunting was not sport, it was survival. Apache warriors pursued deer, antelope, elk, and occasionally buffalo, relying on bows, arrows, and traps perfected over generations. Women gathered roots, mescal, cactus pads, and fruit, carefully supplementing the diet with what the land provided. Food was a matter of life and death, and waste was unknown. Every part of an animal, every usable plant was valued. Apache bands were also masterful strategists. They learned early how to coordinate raids, communicate with signals, and outmaneuver their enemies. A small party could strike a rival tribe, steal livestock, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Their mobility, knowledge of the terrain, and patience gave them an advantage few could match. Yet even before Europeans arrived, the Apache faced constant uncertainty. Droughts could devastate crops and game. Winters could freeze water sources. Tribes could clash violently over resources. Every generation learned to endure hardship, to adapt, to pass knowledge of the land and its dangers to the next. Then came the Spanish, explorers, soldiers, priests, and settlers, crossing north from Mexico in the 16th century. They brought steel swords, firearms, horses, and an ambition unlike anything the Apache had seen. This was not another tribe, this was an empire, and it demanded submission. The Spanish did not see equals. They saw territory to claim, labor to exploit, souls to convert. At first, contact involved trade. Apache bands exchanged hides, food, and knowledge of the land for horses, metal tools, and firearms. But trust was fragile. Spanish promises were often broken. Violence followed. Livestock was seized. Families were threatened, and missionaries imposed foreign beliefs with little regard for Apache autonomy. Conflict escalated quickly. The Apache realized that the Spanish sought not coexistence, but dominance. Every raid, every patrol, every forced settlement threatened their freedom, their survival, and their very way of life. The Apache responded with guerrilla tactics. The land itself became their weapon. They used mountains, canyons, and deserts to conceal movement. They ambushed small detachments, they raided supply caravans, and they vanished, leaving no trace. Even with vastly fewer numbers, they inflicted significant losses on Spanish forces. Each encounter taught the Apache more about their new enemy, their strengths, weaknesses, and patterns. The Spanish attempted to impose missions and presidios, hoping to convert, pacify, and confine the Apache. But these attempts often failed. Apache bands avoided permanent settlement. They moved constantly, adapting to the ever-present threat of attack. Where the Spanish sought control, the Apache sought freedom. Above all, freedom to move, to hunt, to survive on their own terms. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Apache raids against Spanish settlements became frequent and effective. They stole livestock, destroyed crops, and harassed supply lines. Spanish forces, often unfamiliar with the terrain and unprepared for Apache tactics, struggled to respond. The Apache, on the other hand, knew every ridge, every hidden spring, every canyon path. They turned knowledge of the land into power. Even as European influence spread, Apache bands remained independent. They were divided, yes, but their shared understanding of survival, their shared customs, and their shared history gave them cohesion when it mattered most. They learned to cooperate when necessary, to unite against common threats, to protect their families and territories with precision. Freedom for the Apache was not abstract, it was life itself. To be confined was death, to submit was to lose everything. And as the centuries approached the 19th, the Apache would face new waves of conquest, first Mexican authorities, then the United States, but they had already been forged by centuries of struggle, adaptation, and survival. They had learned to fight, to endure, to master the land, and to never surrender. Before Cochise, before Geronimo, before Victorio, the Apache were already legends in their own time, warriors born of a harsh land and relentless necessity. The stage was set for the epic resistance that would define the American Southwest for centuries.
Spanish settlements expanded into Apache territory. Missions were built, forts followed, slavery soon came after. The Apache responded the only way they knew how: raids. Fast, precise, relentless. The Spanish believed that the desert was empty, that the mountains were lifeless, that their guns and steel were enough to command obedience. They were wrong. Columns of Spanish soldiers marched in formation, banners held high, drums beating across dusty plains. They believed in discipline, in numbers, in the certainty of empire. But the Apache did not fight like an army. They struck from shadows, from ridges above, from hidden paths only they knew existed. Spanish weapons were powerful: swords, muskets, cavalry, but heavy, slow, limited in rugged terrain. The Apache, on the other hand, were lighter, faster, and invisible when they needed to be. Every canyon, every ravine, every desert pass became a tool in their hands. The land itself fought alongside them. The desert became an ally. The mountains became shields. Springs and hidden water holes became safe havens and strategic points. Apache scouts could appear on a ridge, disappear behind a crag, and return to strike again in hours. Spanish retaliation was brutal. Apache villages were burned. Families were captured. Every raid by the Apache was met with a punitive expedition, often indiscriminate, often cruel. Missions, intended to convert, became prisons of fear. The Spanish carried out forced labor. Children were taken to serve in distant settlements. Punishment raids swept across valleys and mesas, aiming to break resistance through terror. Yet the Apache did not collapse. They adapted. They learned Spanish patrol patterns, noticing the rhythm of supply convoys and the timing of soldiers' movements. They discovered that mounted soldiers could not follow them into narrow canyons or across jagged cliffs. They realized that muskets, slow to reload, could be avoided with patience, misdirection, and stealth. In response, Apache tactics evolved. Small bands would split into even smaller parties, moving independently, but communicating through signals and scouts. They ambushed supplies at night, burned small outposts, and retreated before the Spanish could organize a response. What seemed like chaos to outsiders was in reality precision. Every attack was carefully calculated, every escape meticulously planned. Some Apache leaders began to gain legendary reputations during this period. Cochise, later known as one of the most formidable Apache chiefs, learned early the value of negotiation paired with force. He would strike where the Spanish were weakest and withdraw before retaliation could be effective. Victorio, though younger at this stage, observed the tactics of the older bands and began forming strategies for coordinated defense and counterattack. Other band leaders operated in secrecy, their names unknown to outsiders, but their deeds recorded in stories that would pass through generations. The Spanish, frustrated, tried to consolidate power through missions and presidios. They built forts at strategic locations, on rivers, near trade routes, along passes through the mountains. They attempted to fortify settlements with stone walls, garrisons, and mounted patrols. Yet even heavily armed soldiers could not match the mobility of Apache bands. The desert could swallow a soldier, erase footprints, and hide the attackers in plain sight. Raids became more daring.
Apache parties would strike deep into Spanish-controlled territories, stealing livestock, supplies, and occasionally freeing captives taken in earlier punitive raids. Some raids were audacious enough to occur in daylight, striking villages and then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. And every time the Spanish attempted a massive campaign, they discovered the same truth. The Apache could not be caught, could not be forced into open battle, could not be tamed. The desert itself was their teacher, their ally, their shield. Mountains were their fortresses, valleys were traps for the unwary. Every canyon was a vantage point, every ridge was a battlefield. Spanish soldiers came to know fear, not just of death, but of the unseen. They would march for days only to find their food stolen, their horses gone, their supply lines ambushed. They would climb mountains only to find Apache warriors waiting silently above, firing arrows or muskets before melting into the shadows. Yet even in the face of relentless raids, the Apache adapted further. They integrated horses into their mobility, becoming mounted warriors themselves. They learned to use Spanish weapons captured in skirmishes. They shared knowledge between bands, creating a network of resistance that spanned deserts, mountains, and valleys across modern-day Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. Spanish retaliation grew more violent. Villages were burned systematically. Families were killed or enslaved. Punishment raids swept across Apache lands in waves meant to break the people's will. But every attempt to crush them only taught the Apache new lessons. They learned to anticipate cavalry movements, to avoid large settlements, to scatter and reunite with precision. By the end of this period, a pattern had emerged. The Spanish were powerful but slow. The Apache were fewer in number, but unstoppable in knowledge, mobility, and adaptability. And so the first blood spilled in this struggle was only the beginning. It would set the stage for centuries of conflict, a war not just for land, but for survival, for freedom, for the right to exist unbowed in a land that could kill as easily as it nourished. The Apache had proven one thing to the Spanish: they could not be conquered. The land had forged them, the desert had trained them, and now the first contact had revealed the stakes. Whoever controlled the land controlled survival itself. And the Apache would fight, fiercely, relentlessly, and without surrender.
The Apache perfected a style of warfare that empires struggled to counter. They did not seek open battle. They did not defend fixed positions. They waited. They watched. And they struck only when victory was certain. It was a way of war unknown to Europeans. Spanish armies were trained to fight in formation, to march across open plains, to meet enemies face to face. Apache warriors had no interest in facing them on those terms. Instead, the desert became their ally. The mountains became shields. Every canyon, ridge, and hidden pass was a weapon. An Apache raid could be over before the soldiers realized they were under attack. A herd of stolen horses would vanish into the hills. A small party of warriors would strike a supply convoy, leave nothing but confusion behind, and disappear without trace. This was psychological warfare. Fear spread faster than bullets. Spanish officials wrote of an enemy they could not catch, an enemy who moved like smoke through the mountains and desert. They described warriors who seemed to vanish into the earth itself, who appeared at the least expected moment, striking with deadly precision and leaving no trail. In one instance, a Spanish patrol advancing toward the Dragoon Mountains found their camp emptied, their horses stolen, and a single arrow lodged in a post. A message, a warning, a demonstration of skill and intent. Another report described a convoy traveling to Santa Fe, attacked at dawn. The Apache struck from ridges above, firing arrows and musket shots, then vanished into hidden ravines.
Spanish soldiers pursued for days, tracking faint footprints across the sand, only to find empty canyons and abandoned waterholes. The soldiers began to speak of ghosts, of enemies who were everywhere and nowhere, of a desert that had eyes and ears. Centuries later, modern militaries would study these same tactics: ambushes, small unit mobility, use of terrain as force multipliers, psychological operations. The Apache were the original masters of asymmetrical warfare. But for them, it was instinct. Survival depended on it. Their society, their daily lives, their very culture were shaped by this constant vigilance. Every child learned to move silently, to spot subtle changes in the landscape, to read animal tracks, to know which spring would appear after a drought. Every warrior was trained in observation, patience, and rapid execution. Every band understood that failure could mean death, and that patience could mean generations of survival. The Apache learned to exploit every weakness in their enemies. Spanish soldiers relied on supply lines, on horses, on formations. Apache warriors learned to disrupt them. They raided lightly guarded convoys, left false trails, and hid in places maps did not mark. They could turn even the mightiest force into a prey of fear. One of the most remarkable aspects of Apache guerrilla warfare was coordination. Even though bands were separate, scattered across hundreds of miles, they developed methods of communication and intelligence. Scouts would travel miles to warn other bands of troop movements. Signals, smoke, fire, or visual markers on ridges could transmit alerts across vast distances. By the time the enemy realized a threat existed, the Apache had already prepared, positioned, and executed. The desert also shaped their weapons and tactics. Arrows flew silently but with lethal accuracy. Horses were fast and nimble, able to navigate narrow passes and rough terrain better than Spanish cavalry. Snares, pits, and traps were employed to slow pursuers or protect families in camps, and every element of the attack was rehearsed and refined through generations. Spanish authorities began to recognize a terrifying reality: the Apache could not be destroyed by numbers or firepower alone. Large-scale punitive campaigns failed. Hundreds of soldiers, fully armed, could not root out a band of 20 warriors who knew the land intimately. The Spanish tried using bribery, hostages, and missions, but the Apache adapted. They learned to evade, to mislead, to anticipate. Every new tactic the Spanish introduced was met with a counter, often before the Spanish even realized the threat existed. Fear became a tool. Soldiers began to hesitate before entering certain canyons. Patrols moved slowly, knowing that every shadow could conceal an ambush. Spanish commanders wrote of an enemy they could not catch, an enemy who moved like smoke through the mountains and desert. They described warriors who seemed to vanish into the earth itself, who appeared at the least expected moment, striking with deadly precision and leaving no trail. Every raid was carefully planned. Every retreat was deliberate. They struck where the enemy was weakest. They avoided where the enemy was strongest. Apache bands developed intelligence networks long before empire arrived. Alliances with neighboring tribes, information gathered from scouts and traders, careful observation of troop movements all contributed to the effectiveness of their campaigns. Even in the harshest conditions, they maintained mobility, endurance, and tactical superiority. The Spanish, frustrated, often escalated retaliation in ways that only hardened Apache resolve. Villages were destroyed, families were taken, supplies burned. Yet the Apache survived. They moved, they hid, they regrouped, they struck back. The mountains and desert were not just home, they were battlefield, shield, and teacher. And the Apache became its ultimate students. Before the world knew the names Cochise, Victorio, or Geronimo, the Apache had already mastered a way of war that would confound every empire that tried to claim their lands. They were not just fighting for territory.
They were fighting for survival. They were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for the right to exist on their own terms. And in every raid, every ambush, every silent movement through the desert, they proved one thing. The Apache could not be conquered. They could not be predicted. They could not be broken. This was warfare before the word existed. Guerrilla tactics, psychological operations, terrain mastery, all instinct, all necessity, all survival. It was a style of war so effective that empires would remember it long after the first musket shot was fired. And it was only the beginning.
When Spanish rule collapsed in the early 19th century, the lands of the Apache did not find peace. A new power emerged: Mexico. The Mexican authorities inherited the same challenges the Spanish had faced: vast deserts, rugged mountains, and a people who refused to bow. They believed that their rule could succeed where the Spanish had struggled. They were wrong. Apache raids continued. Supply caravans were ambushed, livestock disappeared, outposts were attacked. Mexican troops were often poorly equipped, poorly paid, and unprepared for the speed and precision of Apache warriors. Every attempt at pacification was met with the same response as before: mobility, stealth, and survival. And then, as if history itself were repeating, another empire arrived on the horizon: the United States. American expansion pushed relentlessly westward. Railroads cut through Apache lands, forging iron paths through deserts, mountains, and canyons. Settlers followed, claiming water, grazing lands, and villages. Rivers, once hidden and sacred, were diverted for farms and towns. Canyons that had offered shelter and sanctuary were filled with new fences, new patrols, and new eyes. Treaties were signed, promises of peace, boundaries, and land. But these treaties were almost always broken. Reservations were promised, parcels of land where Apache bands could live in relative safety. Those promises were violated. Boundaries were moved, resources were taken, families were displaced. The Apache watched history repeat itself. They had seen Spanish forts, they had seen Mexican patrols. Now they saw the relentless advance of the United States, armed with new weapons, new soldiers, and unyielding ambition. And once again, they chose resistance. The raids that had begun centuries earlier evolved. Apache warriors used the terrain with even greater mastery. They struck settlements, supply lines, and isolated troops. They melted into the desert as the soldiers advanced, leaving no trace, no prisoners, no warning. By mid-19th century, leaders such as Cochise, Mangus Coloradus, and Victorio emerged as legends. They understood that direct confrontation with the growing armies of the United States would be suicide. Instead, they perfected strategies that had been honed over generations: ambush, intelligence gathering, deception, and rapid mobility. Cochise, leader of the Chiricahua Apache, became a figure feared and respected by both Mexicans and Americans. He controlled knowledge of the passes, the canyons, and the springs that armies needed to survive. He struck only when the odds were favorable and withdrew before reinforcements could arrive. His raids were swift, devastating, and impossible to predict. Mangus Coloradus, his ally and leader of another band, coordinated attacks and negotiated carefully when necessary. Victorio, a younger leader, would later study these early confrontations, preparing to lead campaigns that would test the patience and resources of empires. American troops and settlers unfamiliar with the land often miscalculated. They brought guns, cannons, and soldiers, but they could not match the intimate knowledge of terrain that Apache bands had developed over centuries. The desert became a maze, the mountains a fortress, and the rivers a line they dared not cross without caution. Yet the Americans were persistent.
They built forts along trails, stationed cavalry in strategic locations, and attempted to force Apache bands onto reservations. But the Apache were not stationary people. They refused to be confined. They refused to surrender. Families were moved from place to place. Children were taken to schools designed to erase their language and culture. Apache men were hunted, captured, or killed in punitive expeditions. Villages were burned, food stores destroyed, and livestock stolen. But the Apache adapted, as they always had. They learned the patterns of American patrols. They struck supply lines and retreated into the hills. They hid in canyons no soldier dared enter, living off the land, surviving where others would perish. By the 1870s, the struggle had reached a new intensity. The United States launched large-scale campaigns to capture or kill resisting Apache bands. Yet even with superior numbers, weapons, and strategy, the Americans faced the same frustration that had confounded Spanish and Mexican forces for centuries. Apache warriors became masters of endurance. They could travel hundreds of miles without resupply. They knew where water would appear in the driest of seasons. They could strike at night, in winter, in heat that would exhaust even seasoned soldiers. Treaties were signed and broken repeatedly. Reservation boundaries shifted, promises of peace dissolved. Every time an empire claimed to have won, the Apache found a way to resist. The struggle continued. Spanish, Mexican, American. Each empire believed it could succeed where the last had failed. Each was wrong. And in this new age of empires, Apache leaders adapted their strategy, building on centuries of guerrilla warfare. They trained younger warriors, preserved knowledge of the land, and maintained a network of scouts, allies, and spies. The Apache understood that survival was not just about living today. It was about ensuring that their people, their culture, and their freedom would endure. Railroads and settlers could take land. Soldiers could burn villages. Treaties could be broken. But the Apache spirit, born in deserts and mountains, forged in centuries of conflict, could not be extinguished. And so the Apache continued to fight, as they had always fought, with patience, precision, and resolve. The struggle had entered a new era, but the rules remained the same. Move fast, strike hard, vanish before retaliation, survive at all costs. This was a people unbroken by history, unbowed by empires, and unmatched in their mastery of the land that had shaped them. And the next chapter would test them as never before.
One name would come to define Apache resistance: Geronimo. To Americans, he was labeled a criminal. To his people, he was a survivor. He was born in the 1820s in the rugged mountains of northern Mexico. He grew up in a world shaped by centuries of conflict, Spanish incursions, Mexican authority, and then the relentless advance of the United States. By the time he was a young man, he had witnessed the destruction of his villages, the killing of his family, and the displacement of his people. It was in this crucible of loss and survival that Geronimo learned the ways of the land, every canyon, every ridge, every hidden spring. He learned patience, observation, and the deadly precision of ambush. He learned to move silently across deserts that would have killed others. With a small band of warriors, Geronimo became a force that terrified empires. He crossed borders freely between Mexico and Arizona, eluding both U.S. and Mexican troops. He raided settlements when necessary, always striking swiftly, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Every attack was calculated, every retreat deliberate. The U.S. Army responded with overwhelming force. Scouts were deployed, including soldiers and allied Apache who had surrendered or been coerced. Cavalry units moved across deserts and mountains, attempting to anticipate Geronimo's movements. Telegraphs were used to coordinate attacks. Allies, informants, and spies were leveraged to track him.
Yet for years Geronimo evaded capture. Small bands of warriors could disappear into terrain that massive armies could not navigate. The desert and mountains, familiar and merciless, became shields for Geronimo and his people. Even when pursued relentlessly, they could appear suddenly, strike, and vanish again, leaving soldiers frustrated, demoralized, and fearful of unseen enemies. Geronimo's resistance was not just military, it was psychological. Soldiers came to know that no matter how many troops were deployed, how many forts were built, how many patrols were sent, Geronimo could not be cornered. Fear became part of his strategy. Every raid spread a reputation that magnified his influence far beyond the size of his band. But even Geronimo's cunning had limits. The relentless pressure of U.S. and Mexican forces took its toll. Families were forced to move repeatedly. Supplies were scarce. Allies were captured or surrendered under threat. The small bands that once struck fear into thousands were slowly worn down. When Geronimo finally surrendered in 1886, it was not because he had been defeated in battle. It was because his people were exhausted. They had endured decades of conflict. They had been chased, starved, and displaced. Children were hungry. Families were grieving. Leaders could no longer ensure the survival of everyone in the band. Geronimo laid down his arms, not as a concession to the army, but as a final act to preserve what remained of his people. The war was over. But the cost was immense. Entire generations of Apache were displaced. Villages had been destroyed. Land that had sustained their people for centuries was lost. The treaties that promised peace and autonomy had been broken. The survivors were sent to reservations far from their homelands, confined to areas that could not sustain their traditional way of life. Yet even in surrender, the Apache spirit endured. Geronimo himself would live for decades after his surrender, becoming a symbol both to Americans and to his own people. To the United States, he was a curiosity, a spectacle. He was paraded at fairs and exhibitions, his reputation as a savage magnified for public consumption. To the Apache, he remained a hero, a survivor, a leader, a guardian of their traditions and stories. The last war of the Apache was not a simple battle between armies. It was the culmination of centuries of resistance. It was the fight of a people against overwhelming odds. It was the defense of freedom, culture, and survival against successive empires, Spanish, Mexican, and American. The cost of that resistance was measured not in victories or defeats alone, but in lives lost, lands abandoned, and traditions endangered. And yet, the lessons of Geronimo's campaigns would resonate far beyond the Southwest. Modern militaries would study these tactics: guerrilla warfare, asymmetrical strategy, rapid mobility, and psychological operations. The Apache had done what empires could not. They had survived on their own terms, even when the world sought to erase them. Geronimo's story and the story of the Apache is a testament to endurance. It is a reminder that true power is not always measured in numbers or weapons, but in knowledge, strategy, and the will to survive. And though the last war had ended, the echoes of Apache resistance would continue in the land, in memory, and in history.
The Apache were defeated, but they did not surrender. After decades of resistance, the armies of the United States finally imposed their will. Bands were hunted down, villages burned, supplies destroyed, leaders captured, families forced under reservations far from the mountains, deserts, and rivers that had sustained them for centuries. Some were sent to Florida, thousands of miles from their ancestral lands. Others were sent to Alabama, to the lands of strangers, under strict supervision. Camps were fenced, movements restricted, freedoms removed. Children were taken from their families, sent to boarding schools designed to erase identity. Hair was cut, clothing standardized, language forbidden. They were taught to forget the words of their elders, to abandon the songs of their people, to abandon the stories that had guided them for generations.
Yet even under this relentless pressure, the Apache did not disappear. Culture survived in memory. Even when languages were punished, the words persisted in whispers among family members. Even when ceremonies were forbidden, rituals continued in secret, in hidden glens, under moonlight, in abandoned canyons. Even when land was stolen, the knowledge of the mountains, the rivers, the hidden springs persisted in memory and practice. Traditions endured in silence. Hunting methods passed from grandfather to grandson. Stories of raids, victories, losses, and survival told quietly around fires. Skills honed over centuries, tracking, stealth, strategy, quietly preserved. The Apache knew that survival was not just about living in the moment. It was about maintaining identity, knowledge, and spirit for the generations to come. The world around them moved on. Railroads crossed deserts that had been home for centuries. Settlers claimed rivers, valleys, and mesas. Governments redrew boundaries, signed treaties, and broke promises. Yet the Apache remained. Even in exile, even under strict supervision, even when stripped of land and autonomy, their resilience was undeniable. Communities reorganized, families reunited when possible. Leaders emerged to guide the people through unfamiliar territory and new laws. And the stories of Cochise, Geronimo, Victorio, Mangas Coloradas, lived on, shaping the identity of every generation that followed. The United States declared victory. Maps were redrawn. Reservations were established. Apache names appeared in books, newspapers, and military reports. But the people behind the names, the spirit, the courage, the memory of centuries of resistance, could not be conquered. Even in the harshest conditions, the Apache adapted. They farmed where they were allowed. They raised families under watchful eyes. They preserved knowledge in subtle ways, teaching children to survive, to remember, and to endure. History often records the empires and the treaties, the forts and the soldiers, but the real story is in the people who endured against impossible odds. The Apache may have been imprisoned, exiled, and separated from their land. They may have faced hunger, disease, and cultural suppression. They may have been forced to speak another language, adopt alien customs, and obey foreign authorities. But they survived. They endured. They adapted. They preserved what could not be stolen: memory, culture, and identity. Every whispered story, every hidden ceremony, every lesson passed from parent to child was an act of defiance, a refusal to disappear. And over time, the Apache would reclaim fragments of their lands, their voice, and their traditions. Reservations became communities of resilience. Cultural practices re-emerged. Language, once punished, began to return through schools, programs, and elders' teachings. The Apache proved that defeat does not mean surrender, that loss of land does not mean loss of identity, that exile does not erase a people. And in this quiet endurance, in this survival against overwhelming force, lies a truth that empires could never fully grasp. You can conquer land, you can destroy villages, you can imprison a people, but you cannot conquer spirit. You cannot erase memory. You cannot kill the will to survive. The Apache remained, and through them, the lessons of resilience, courage, and resistance endure, a testament to a people who refused to disappear even when history seemed determined to erase them.
The Apache never built empires. They never raised grand monuments. They did not carve their names into stone or inscribe their victories in gold. And yet, their legacy is no less monumental. For centuries, empires arrived with banners, armies, and the certainty of conquest. Spanish soldiers, Mexican militias, and American troops all believed that they could bend the land and its people to their will. Each in turn underestimated the resilience of those who had been born of desert and mountain, forged in hardship and endurance.
the Apache proved something far more enduring than conquest or empire. They proved that even the strongest armies, the most organized militaries, the most determined governments could be resisted. They proved that survival itself, the ability to endure, adapt, and maintain identity under relentless pressure, could be a victory more profound than any battlefield triumph. Freedom for the Apache was not an abstract ideal, it was tangible, necessary, and non-negotiable. To be confined, to be controlled, was to risk starvation, vulnerability, and death. For generations they defended that freedom, not with monuments, not with gold, not with sprawling cities, but with knowledge passed quietly from parent to child, with traditions preserved in secret, with courage lived every day. Even in defeat, exile, and captivity, the Apache spirit endured. Villages could be burned, land could be stolen, children could be taken, languages punished, ceremonies forbidden. Yet the people persisted. Culture survived in silence. Stories of warriors like Cochise, Geronimo, Mangas Coloradas, and Victorio lived on. Lessons of survival, strategy, and respect for the land were carried in memory, whispered around fires, and passed through generations. The Apache had learned that sometimes survival itself, the quiet act of endurance, of passing knowledge to the next generation, was the ultimate defiance. In the modern era, Apache communities continue to honor that legacy. Reservations stand as reminders of both loss and resilience. Language programs, cultural centers, and ceremonies revive what was nearly erased. Elders teach children the knowledge of the mountains, rivers, and deserts. The stories of raids, resistance, and survival are no longer whispers. They are preserved, studied, and celebrated. Their history is a lesson to the world, that power alone does not guarantee dominance, that vast armies cannot always conquer those who understand the land and themselves, that true resilience lies not in weapons, but in strategy, knowledge, and spirit. The Apache never sought to dominate. They never built empires to last, but they built something far more enduring, a legacy of defiance, survival, and the preservation of freedom against overwhelming odds. History may have ignored them for centuries, books may have overlooked their struggles, empires may have dismissed them as obstacles, nuisances, or savages, but now their story can no longer be ignored. It survives in memory, it survives in culture, it survives in the very land they defended. Every canyon, every river, every desert ridge carries their story. Every lesson of patience, endurance, and strategy lives on. Even as the world changes, the Apache remind us that survival, lived with courage, wisdom, and defiance, is itself a triumph. Their story is not only about what they endured, it is about what they taught the world, that empires, no matter how vast, can fail, that land and freedom belong not only to those who claim it by force, but to those who know it, respect it, and fight to survive within it. That memory, culture, and identity can outlast armies, borders, and centuries of oppression. The Apache never built empires, they destroyed none, but they proved that even the mightiest powers can be resisted. They proved that survival itself can be victory, and they proved that freedom, however fleeting, however challenged, is worth defending with every ounce of courage a people can summon. Their story was never meant to be forgotten. It was simply ignored, until now. And as we look across deserts and mountains, as we trace the paths of raids, the canyons they used as shields, the rivers that sustained them, we see not just a history of conflict, we see a story of endurance, a story of strategy, a story of spirit, a story of a people who refused to disappear. The Apache remains. Their legacy endures. If you want to keep uncovering real histories, stories of people who were supposed to disappear but didn't, make sure you subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments what part of the Apache story interests you the most. Your support will go a long way in bringing back the voices that were pushed to the limits.
And in their defiance, we find a lesson for all who face overwhelming odds. Survival, identity, and courage can never be conquered.